Joining us now is Ty Cobb, former White House attorney in the first Trump administration. It's good to see you. Look, all of us knew that Ms. Halligan is not someone who is experienced, not at all experienced in these kinds of court cases. Nevertheless, what do you make of this latest reporting?
It's shocking. You couldn't find a high school stock boy at Home Depot who could have handled this more ineptly than Lindsay Halligan did. Taking an indictment that the grand jury never saw, having the foreman sign it, and then presenting it to a judge, that's the height of ineptitude and misconduct.
So when you say misconduct, let's talk about the implications for James Comey, because is it a procedural misstep that can be corrected, or is this denying a defendant due process?
It's both, but I think the interesting thing about this development is that there is no indictment, as Michael Dreeben, who is one of the country's most skilled advocates, has 100 Supreme Court arguments, made plain in court that there is no indictment. If only the foreman and some grand juror who was hanging out in the courtroom saw it, that's two. A quorum is 12. You need a quorum to return an indictment. So the indictment that was presented and that they've been proceeding on really is a nullity. And that's potentially procedurally critical here, because typically if an indictment is dismissed, the government has 6 months to represent, notwithstanding the expiration of the statute of limitations. This is an indictment, though, that doesn't really have to be dismissed. It doesn't really exist. It was never properly returned. So I think what we heard today, shocking, never occurred before in American jurisprudence. I think it will be dispositive. But on the other hand, there's so many dispositive issues here, including her illegal appointment.
Well, I do want to ask you about that. You've said that you think both Halligan and Attorney General Bondi could be disbarred over this case against Comey, and that was before we learned what happened today in court. It also raises questions for me that if you're going to use Lindsay Halligan in this manner, the fact that she has no experience, is anyone overseeing that work to make sure that problems don't arise? But what do you think now?
Well, I do think that both Halligan and Bondi should be disbarred. Bondi has twice submitted affirmations to this court about the propriety of Lindsay Halligan's grand jury presentation. She knew this. There's no way she could not have known this, and that's just means that she lied, or that she's equally incompetent, but more likely that she lied.
So let's talk about what happens now. Could this be brought back before a full grand jury? And we're back at the point where James Comey then is looking to get the case dismissed on the grounds of vindictive and selective prosecution.
So that hasn't been dismissed yet, or thrown out, or the nullity been recognized. I do think if the ruling is that there is no indictment, there's no indictment to dismiss. Only if the indictment is dismissed would the 6-month rule for representation come into play. So what happened today is very significant in that regard legally. But yes, Comey has, the misconduct issues, the miscarriage of justice issues, the denial of due process issues, the vindictiveness issues. This case is dead. This case is never going to get to trial. And Comey will, never be held accountable as the government has desired and as the president ordered Bondi to see to.
Apart from James Comey, there is this lingering question about the future of Lindsay Halligan. Along with New York Attorney General Letitia James, Comey is separately arguing had been separately arguing to disqualify her as the lead prosecutor in their cases, calling into question the lawfulness of her appointment in the first place. Are there, do you think, convincing arguments in that effort?
Oh, yes. I mean, the statute's very clear. The Attorney General and the President had 120 days worth of interim U.S. attorneys to appoint before the rule went to the district court. They denied the district court that rule, tried to circumvent it by appointing Halligan. They did so ineffectively and in a way that is prohibited by the law. I think that decision will definitely go against Halligan.
Related to the grand jury, the procedures.
So Anna, I was in another room of our studio working on something unrelated to the Comey matter when I looked up and saw Fallon reporting with you, and I saw the banner, and what I said in reaction is unprintable. So this is a very, very big deal. We knew that something had gone awry with respect to the presentation to the grand jury based on Judge Fitzpatrick's decision the other day. You and I were talking this morning about the fact that Judge Fitzpatrick had sort of said there were 3 categories of irregularities. One had to do with the use of evidence from old search warrants. One had to do with misstatements of the law that Lindsay Halligan had apparently made when she was before the grand jury. And the third had to do with the way in which the indictment actually was handed down and a gap in recordings of the grand jury proceedings themselves. And what Judge Fitzpatrick had said at that time was there were only 7 minutes between when Lindsay Halligan said in an affidavit that she was handed the 3-count indictment that the grand jury refused to return a true bill on, meaning they had refused one of the counts. And when the hearing started before another magistrate judge in the district, Lindsay Vala, at which the grand jury presented the 2-count indictment with which Jim Comey has been charged. And Judge Fitzpatrick said in his decision, something here doesn't add up. Either Ms. Halligan is mistaken as to the timing, or something went awry in the grand jury, because 7 minutes is not enough time to present an indictment all over again to a grand jury, meaning if they refuse the first indictment, you don't have enough time in 7 minutes to then present the second indictment, the one that was returned, the one that was charged against Comey, to everyone here. And today, based on Fallon's reporting, we now know the answer to that mystery, which was that the full grand jury never saw that indictment. That is the height of prosecutorial misconduct. It is a basis in and of itself for the dismissal of this case. There is a reason that there was stunned silence in the courtroom. The other thing that I can't figure out, and I was looking at my computer right before I came on air with you, the 2-count indictment that was returned against Jim Comey has a signature of Lindsay Halligan, but it also has what appears to be a redacted signature of the grand jury foreperson. So one remaining mystery, and apologies if you and Fallon already discussed this, is how did they get that person to even sign this instrument and then return it in full view of all of these grand jurors? They then handed it up to Magistrate Judge Vala and represented that this was an indictment on which more than 16, I believe it was 14 or 16 grand jurors voted to indict Jim Comey. If the full grand jury didn't get a presentation on this, who exactly did? And under what pretext was the foreperson of the grand jury, who you have to imagine was never a grand juror before and is relying on prosecutors for the rules of the game?
Well, and
under
remember, Lindsay Halligan hasn't prosecuted a case before. She was the U.S. attorney, the lone signature on this indictment against James Comey, which was by itself super unusual, super eye-opening. What you're describing here, based on what we learned, sounds outrageous, Lisa, but the judge hasn't ruled on this. So what questions do you still have as he weighs a ruling?
Well, first of all, this morning's hearing wasn't on that particular issue, right? It was on the selective and vindictive prosecution of Jim Comey. The question about grand jury misconduct is a motion that hasn't even been made yet by Jim Comey's legal team. Why? Because up until a couple of days ago, they were even fighting for the evidence to support that motion. They had an instinct that something had gone wrong in the grand jury. Where does that instinct come from? It comes from the transcript of the return of the indictment in the first place. That is a transcript that we obtained, and it shows Lindsay Halligan handing simultaneously to that magistrate judge 2 signed instruments. And the magistrate judge says to her, sort of, which of these 2 is the actual charging document?
We just exposed Trump and his entire operation. I've never seen anything like this, at least not in a very high-profile case like this, where it seems like the grand jury wasn't even given all the information. We got inklings of this a couple days ago, right, when the judge put out that report where they were like, this seems fishy, and it seems like, you know, the accusations from the Comey side that this is, railroading, and the process doesn't seem like it was followed. I actually see a lot of evidence on this, and I guess it was confirmed today that the grand jury never got to see the full and final indictment, which is weird to me because the grand jury is the one that I think has to approve the indictment. Now, look, I'm not a lawyer, and frankly, it doesn't necessarily look like the people representing Trump are lawyers either. But it seems like to me the process is, with the grand jury, you impanel a grand jury, you bring forward evidence that you think there's probable cause to lay charges on specific indictments. You say, this is what we want to indict this person or these people on these charges. And here's the evidence. Now, in a grand jury, you don't need to prove guilt. So you don't need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. You basically just have to say, we have enough evidence that we could credibly do a trial here, and it's worth exploring. And so the bar is lower, and you don't need to get unanimity from grand juries usually. So you don't need to get everyone in the grand jury to agree. So it's usually an easier process. But obviously, if you're hiding information from the grand jury, if you're not letting them know what the actual indictments will be and whatnot, how can they be said to have made an informed decision, right? This goes far beyond a little technical quibble. This goes far beyond you and I saying we don't feel these charges are valid, but from a legal perspective, maybe there's some debate there. For example, people are saying on the John Bolton case that simultaneously it's obviously Trump is going after one of his enemies, but there may be some facts in favor of a criminal indictment there, maybe. And so that's why there are charges there. That case isn't looking like it's going to get thrown out. This one, though, it looks like political railroading. The very sort of thing Trump accused Biden of doing to him, but he's actually doing it to others.